So I'm Ryan, and Amanda and I are so excited to have you here tonight. And we're thankful for Bryan from Brown Foreman for going to give us this Scottish education. And Amanda's got a couple of quick announcements that she wants to make, and then we will pass it off to Bryan.
Yes. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here tonight. This video will be also available on our website too later this evening or early tomorrow, just in case you ever want to go back. In your box there was one of our info cards too. We're going to be launching micro boxes this summer, which are similar in size to the kits you got today. We really love this virtual tasting with Bryan. We had a really good time with the Old Forester one, so we're really looking forward to today. So keep an eye out too for other micro kits, which are some pretty cool concepts for the summer. Our first one launches next week, and it's our s'mores kit box. We'll also have the Metro Pets box, which for you and fur babies, and then we have the slumber party box too. So we have a lot of good things coming out relative in the size to this, as well as our larger boxes again in the fall. So we'll send it over to Bryan. We'll get started.
Stupendous. Thank you, Amanda and Ryan, so much for having me again tonight. Tonight, we're going to talk Scotch. And I know that a lot of people get intimidated or put off by the notion of Scotch. And it's one of the great misunderstood whiskeys in the world, or even liquors in the world. And part of that is because of the association of a small portion of Scotland. And everybody hears Scotch, they think peat and smoke and yuck, and I don't like that, and Band-Aids and ew and all those things. So tonight we're going to dispel some of those myths. We're going to do some of that with education and a lot of that with tasting. To start with, that association of of peat and smell and smoke comes from a very small island, a very small region of Scotland called the Isla. It's spelled I-S-L-A-Y, looks like Islay, pronounced like Isla. In that area of Scotland is an island basically in the middle of the Atlantic. And because it's an island in the middle of the Atlantic, as you can imagine, there's lots of wind and water and mist and all of those things. And because of that, there's not a lot of ways to dry malted barley. So one of the things that they discovered very early on, by early on, I'm talking early 17th or 1700s, late 18th century, was that they could dig down into the soil and find peat. And that moss, that peaty moss, was very dense and had a very low burn rate, and it was burned forever. And they could put that underneath their barley, and it would come up and it would dry the barley out so that they could start the fermentation process. They could stop the malting and start fermentation. And that smoke stayed in the whiskey forever, and it never ever left. So what people associate with that Scotch is from that early drying period. Now, the conditions on the Isla haven't changed, and there are some distilleries that have installed gas stoves for malted barley drying, but many of them still use the traditional methods of peating the malt and creating that kind of aroma and that flavor profile of smoke and peat. And it's it's a characteristic, it's a trademark, unfortunately, or fortunately, of Scotland. But what's important to remember about that process is that there are about 130 distilleries in the small island of Scotland. And of those 130 distilleries, there are only 13 that reside on the Isla. And those 13 are the ones that are predominantly known for their peating process. Now, that's not to say that there isn't peat everywhere. In fact, one of the brands that we're going to taste tonight, the Benirach, is a traditional floor malting distillery, and they do have a peated version of their whiskeys. We're not trying either of those tonight. We're trying just straight scotches, but there is a peated version of those scotches as well. Each of the marks that we'll be trying, there's a smoky version of. So there is a traditionality to that and a history to it, but it is not the defining characteristic, or it should not be the defining characteristic of Scotch to anybody who's a whiskey drinker. So if that's where you're coming from, if that's your frame of reference, I hope we can dispel some of that today, and we can get you down a new path on whiskey. The next thing we need to talk about before we start our tasting is that there are 5 regions in Scotland. We've already talked about one of them, that's the Isla. There's also a small peninsula off the southern tip of Scotland called Campbelltown, or Campbelltown, spelled like Campbelltown, pronounced Campbellton. And there it used to be a hub because there was so much freight traffic off of Campbelltown. There used to be 12, 13 distilleries on this very small peninsula. They have whittled down dramatically over the years. And to my knowledge, there's only 2 or 3 now left in Campbellton. And then there's what we call the lowland region of Scotland, which is kind of draw a dotted line right through the middle. And the lower half is the lowlands, which is really geographically complicated, I understand. And then above that geographical line is a region called the Highlands. High, low, they were creative. The Highlands is a very hilly, very, very complicated territory. And then right out of the top of the Highlands, there's a little U that's cut out, and it's called the Speyside. Most of the distilleries, or the most populous area for distilleries now, is in this what is called the Speyside, including one of the ones we'll be trying tonight, the Benirach. The Benirach and many of the distilleries from the Speyside still refer to themselves as Highland Scotches because they are cut out of that region. In fact, it wasn't until 1996 that a PGI, or a preferred global indicator, was given to that region to make them their own distinguished independent area of Scotland called the Speyside. They had to prove that there was something different about their characteristics that made them unique to the Highlands. And if you when we taste the 2 products, you should be able to identify those pretty easily. The Glendronach is based in the Highlands. It's a mid-Highland region. It is an elevated terrain, so there is a lot of it's in a depth terrain. It is in a glen. Glen, by the way, as we talk about these 2 brands tonight, Glen, Valley, Ben, Hill. Glen, Ben. Simple enough, but I get asked the question all the time, so I want to make sure we clarify it. Glen down, Ben up. So these are Glendronachs. They are their own water source. Everything of theirs is independent. We source everything locally, whether it be our grain or our water. So everything is sourced directly from our own land. So we do try to keep everything tight and repeatable, which is really hard to do with Scotch when you're relying on 12, 15, 20 years worth of maturation for a product. It's very difficult to maintain consistency. So we're very proud of being able to do that, whether it's controlling the quality of the wood that we acquire or the quality of barley that we harvest. Next and last thing before we get to tasting and we start talking about what makes Scotch Scotch and why Scotch is what Scotch is that there are only 3 ingredients in Scotch. In any single malt Scotch, there are only 3 ingredients. It's barley, water, and yeast. That's it. Anything else is no longer Scotch. It is no longer a product of Scotland. To be called a Scotch legally, you can only be those 3, a single malt Scotch. You can only be those 3 ingredients, water, barley, and yeast. You must be distilled and stored the entirety of your life on the island of Scotland. Meaning if I distilled my product, I can't ship it to London to be matured. It has to stay in Scotland proper. I can distill it up to 3 times. And so I can basically get it to almost pure grain alcohol, but I have to barrel it at 145. So it means I cannot barrel my product any higher than 145. So no matter how much I distill it and how much I purify my distillate, I have to barrel it at 145. It has to be barreled at a certain thing before I can send it out. And you'll find that most distilleries will only double distill, and they're barreling at about the same proof that U.S. bourbon does, right around 125. And then the last thing is it must be rested on wood for no less than 3 years to be called a Scotch. It's a similar rule to the U.S. It's a similar to bourbon. It's a similar rule to Irish whiskey. The 3 years seems to be the world standard for how long something has to be rested to be called something. So 3 years for Scotch in Scotland with Scottish products. The entirety of the process must be done in Scotland. So before I move on to the tasting, any questions about the product itself? And that's good. So we're going to start with the Glendronach 12-year-old, which should be the first one in your sample kit. The first one all the way to your left is the Glendronach 12-year-old. Now, the Glendronach, as I mentioned, is a Highland Scotch, and it is aged exclusively in sherry casks. Predominantly going to be Oloroso casking, with about 25% of it being Pedro Jimenez casking. Oloroso is the much drier sherry that comes from the northern region, whereas Pedro Jimenez is going to be a much sweeter sherry that comes from the southern region of Spain. And this is all going to be Spanish oak. So everything that you're tasting is a Spanish oak, but what was in it beforehand contributes to what is going to be in your bottle tonight. Why does it matter that it's sherry and not just raw Spanish wood? Well, sherry is unique in the wine or the spirits world because sherry stays in the wood, like absurdly so. Like if you were to make a piece of Spanish oak like a sponge and twist it out, you could twist out almost 10 liters of sherry in a sherry butt that we're going to be shoving our whiskey into and out of for the next 12, 15, 20, 30 years, like I mentioned. So having that sherry still in the wood, no matter how many times you rechar it and reblast it, it's always going to be there. So that sherry is in there and it contributes to the whiskey very, very dramatically, as we're going to discover here in the next two glasses. Couple of preps before we go. I always sip my whiskey in a Glencairn, and if you were with us in the Old Forester one, this will all be repeat information, but I'm going to say it anyway for anybody new. I use the Glencairn because it's got a bulb at the bottom, and that bulb at the bottom allows the flavors and the aromas to kind of hover around the bottom of the glass. When it comes up to the top, it becomes a flute kind of like, and it goes straight into your nose. So when nosing it, it's all concentrated right there in it. When you're nosing your whiskey, it's going to be about a finger below your nose with your mouth open. So when you're nosing, you want to keep your mouth open and just breathe in through your nose. And another note is that your nose works like your ears. It works in stereo. There's two sides of your nostrils, two sides of your brain. Each nostril goes to a part of your brain, and you want to make sure you experience the whole glass when you're nosing, so that both sides of your nose are taking it in and enveloping it and really getting to feel for what's in the glass. So we can give it a quick nose, and right off the bat, you're going to discover some of the things that really make this one a very popular whiskey among Scotch enthusiasts, and it's the nose. The nose on this particular brand of whiskey, the Glendronach, the entire line, is very big. It's very flavorful. It's really going to exemplify all of the things that the Highland is about. If you ever got a fruitcake for Christmas, that's going to be maybe the best descriptor I can give you for what to expect from your Glendronach Scotch. You're going to have cranberries. You're going to have nuts. You're going to have weird cherry filling that Grandma threw in there. You're going to have a lot of dark chocolate and a lot of yeast and bread, and that's all coming up in the whiskey right in the nose, and it's all right there in the forefront. So it's all there, and it's a beautiful nosing whiskey. I want to make a candle out of this and just let my house smell like Glendronach whiskey all day. My wife thinks it affects the kids, whatever. So we're going to give this a little sip. And as always with the first sip of whiskey, hold it the first sip in your mouth for a few seconds. Give your brain time to adjust. Effectively, whiskey and all liquor is poison. So your brain is going to tell you that it's bad and you shouldn't be doing this anymore. But we're going to overrule our brain by letting it rest in our mouth for a couple of seconds before we go into our second sip, which will really give us some identifiable characteristics. So to your first sip. And right off the bat, it is a good proof. You're looking at a 90 or at an 86. It's got a nice proof range to it. It's got a good balance. Even when that first sip comes through, there's some heat. Yes, there's a good hug in the chest. Those are all things that you should be experiencing on that first sip. But when we take our second sip now, you should be able to start identifying some of those flavors that I mentioned before. Start looking. You're going to want to look for those traditional Highland notes. See if you can find the yeast. See if you can find a little bit of bread. See if you can find some cherries and some cranberries, some chocolates. Those are the things that are going to be most easily identifiable in the Glendronach. So let's see if we can find those real quick. And to me, they're all right there, right in the front and center. That's my palate. They hit right in the mid palate, and it kind of just explodes and really makes the middle and the back of your tongue kind of explode, and that dry kind of tartness with dried fruit and chocolate covered bitters and cherries and dark chocolate flavors. They're all kind of right there present. Now, if you have your little dropper with you, and you put a little water in there, and I hope you did. I should have given Ryan and Amanda instructions to do it. We're just going to take our dropper here, and we're going to put just 2 drops right through our whiskey. boink, boink. And if you look down into your glass as you drop those in, it's going to look like an oil slick. It's going to look like a little oil spilled on your driveway and then it rained the next morning. And what's happening here is that whiskey and water are hydrophobic. Whiskey is hydrophobic. It doesn't like water. It thinks it's bad. It wants to separate and fight with it. So what that's going to do is it's going to really create a whole nother flavor profile just with a couple extra drops of whiskey. And putting it on the nose, then the nose is muted down a little bit. You're able to really kind of get into some different flavor profiles. You get a lot more floral bouquet, things that you should find in when you're adding water to this one in particular is, like I mentioned, a lot more floral notes, little lavender, maybe even some rose essence in there. And it just changes the dynamic of it. And then that little bit of water also in there will activate a different palate range too. So I'm going to go ahead and finish my sample on this one and we'll move on to the 15, but let's experience a little bit of difference with the 15 or the 12 here. And then on the palate, that's going to bring in the heat a little bit. It's going to add some of that pepper. The oils are really breaking up and fighting in that. And it's really causing it to create a whole new palate sensation. The Glendronach is really an interesting distillery. It's arguably the second legal distillery in Scotland in the early 1700s. The Glenlivet being the first George Smith's distillery from the famous King George visit in the late 1700s, early 1800s. They had a visit with the king, and he asked for a glass of Glenlivet. And for the longest time, Glenlivet was in danger of being synonymous with Scotch. Like you say Kleenex, you mean facial tissue, but it's a Kleenex. You say rollerblades, you mean inline skates, but you're saying rollerblades. Glenlivet was really in danger of having that same association, so much so that, in fact, the trading of whiskey was very common practice into the mid-1900s. And most of them traded under the name Glenlivet and then their town. So in our case, it was actually listed as Glenlivet Glendronach. There was a real association with Glenlivet as synonymous with Scotch. It meant the same thing for many, many years. The son of George Smith actually filed a petition in court to make people stop calling themselves Glenlivet, but it had already reached such a point of association that the judge didn't feel it was right. And this is 1798, by the way, that it was right for them to have the only name Glenlivet. But what he did award them instead was the right to call themselves the Glenlivet. So you're only allowed, if you still associate, and many brands do, as Glenlivet, you can only call yourself Glenlivet. You cannot call yourself the Glenlivet. And that's how they separated the association. And actually it did end up killing the brand association with Scotch to that brand. Glendronach, however, was founded by a name called James Alderus. And James Alderus was a big friend of the 5th Duke of Gordon, who lived in Elgin, just a bit north of where our distillery is. And there's actually a huge monument to the 5th Duke of Gordon in the town square of Elgin. And it was his association and his friendship with the king that brought him to Scotland. And it was James Alderus's insistence on the king coming to Scotland that got him there in the first place, which turned distilleries from illicit to legal shortly after the king's visit. If you think Scotch in the mid 1700s, you got to think moonshine during Prohibition in the United States. It was the same kind of thing. These guys would run their stills out of caves, and then they would mature all their stuff in the back of the cave. And if their still broke down, they'd save what they could, take all of the broken pieces to the local sheriff and say, hey, we found a still. Here's the broken pieces we found. And they'd get a reward, and they'd take the reward and go fix their still and start it right back up again. So it was this cycle of everybody knew it was happening, but no one was going to try to stop it. It also led to something that's really unique in terms of maturation. So if you've ever been to a bourbon tour, are you familiar with a rick house? A rick house is a storage facility for bourbon barrels. And they're many stories high and many stories deep and many stories long, and they're huge barrel warehouses. Well, Scotland's different. Because they started their maturation process in caves going back into the 1700s, the first storage houses they built, called dunnages, were very, very small. There were one-story buildings. You'd smack your head on the beams if you don't duck your heads, and they're only stacked about 3 barrels high. So however big 3 barrels is for you, that's whether it's a hogshead or a American oak whiskey cask or a Spanish sherry butt or whatever, they're only 3 barrels high. So when you're walking through, they're halfway underground and they're very low 1-story buildings, and it keeps that maturation process going of that kind of cave-like development where you're consistent with the temperatures around you. So we're going to move into the Glendronach 15-year, the bottle, if you will. And this one is absolutely my favorite whiskey, regardless of brand or style. It was the 2020 Whiskey Best in Show. So of all whiskeys, regardless of make or origin, this was the best whiskey this was voted the best whiskey in the world in 2020 by the San Francisco World Spirits Competition, which is generally considered the authority on establishing brands. I actually still know, I shouldn't say new, like it's past tense. I actually know one of the judges for that competition. And after I saw the awards, I reached out and said, "Hey, you gave us Best in Show." He's like, "Oh, I knew that one as soon as I put it in the glass." It was a fantastic. I was so happy to vote that whiskey that high. So this is, again, very amber in color, 15 years. Now, the difference between this and the 12-year-old in terms of barrel blending is that it is about 50% Pedro Jimenez and 50% Oloroso. It's much, much closer to that 50-50 margin. Call it 51-49 or 52-48, but it's going to be right in that 50-50 category. So what's going to happen is you're going to have an entire palate coverage with this. It activates everything from the tip of your tongue to the back of your throat and under your tongue. It leaves you salivating. If you've ever done a whiskey or a wine tasting, I should say, and you're familiar with that, where they give you a Sauvignon Blanc perhaps, and they have you lean forward to activate your salivatory glands after the Sauvignon Blanc to show the acid. Well, this does the same thing. There's a lot of acid and oil in there, and it creates and activates those salivatory glands, and it really brings the flavor forward and just opens up your entire mouth. And then the finish on it lasts just the right amount of time. It doesn't hang with you forever, but it sits there and hangs, and you get to enjoy it. So let's go ahead and give this a nose. And just right on the nose, I love this one. It's all chocolate covered cherries and dark red fruit, strawberries. Let's go ahead and have yourself a sip there. And just like I said, it starts at the tip of your tongue and starts rolling all the way back and telling your entire body, your entire mouth, just how to feel and be happy and enjoy yourself. I love this one. This is one I don't add water to, but I would encourage you, if you are exploring and kind of creating these, to do the same thing. Take your water dropper, give yourself a drop or two into the glass and give it a sip. While you're doing that, one of the things I'll talk about real quick is oil. And we've mentioned it a few times, but I haven't really demonstrated how it's in there. So I do not roll my whiskey very often, but I'm doing it here so I can illustrate a point. If you roll your whiskey glass and get that whiskey up your glass sides a little bit and then let it rest, you're going to see the lines of whiskey start slowly running back down your glass. That's called the legs of a whiskey. The legs will indicate to you how long or how much oil or how much oil is in the glass and how much of it has been filtered out. There are some where you'll do that and you'll swirl it up and it'll just come right back down. There's just no oil in it. It's been filtered out. It's been chill filtered perhaps. But we do not chill filter the oils out of our whiskey. We want them in there. They think they're the part of the essence of the whiskey. So we refer to this whiskey as having very long legs. It takes a long time for the whiskey to come back down the glass and back into the liquid. So you can see those legs running all the way down the glass. And it's really just a testament to the craftsmanship that you have that really long drawl of whiskey back down into the glass.
So
the other thing that I'll note.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Nope, go right ahead, please.
I know you said that you don't add water to this one. Is there a reason in particular that you don't do that?
I love it. I think it's perfect the way it is. It's simple. I mean, honestly, there's no grand reason for it. This is my favorite whiskey. I love it the way it is. I don't put it on ice. I don't put it in anything. I love this whiskey. That's literally the only reason my palate says don't do this.
Fair enough.
And again, everybody's palate's unique. The only wrong way to drink something is the way that you don't like it, right? So I say that the beginning, middle, and end of every training session, If you don't like it, don't drink it. If you do like it a certain way that's unconventional, drink it the way you like it. There's no wrong way to drink your whiskey, as long as you're enjoying it and you're trying the whiskey the way you want to try it. I don't use rocks, generally speaking, ice, for whiskey, and if I do, it's going to be a huge, big ice cube, which I can't fit in this. So I generally speaking, I will not use ice. Ice numbs the palate. Water numbs, or cold numbs the palate and diminishes the flavor profile. So if I ask for ice, I can generally discern that I don't like the product. If I'm saying, oh, let's put some ice on that, see how it goes on ice. What I'm saying is, that's horse crap. I don't know why you're asking me to drink this. I'd like to numb my palate so I don't experience this anymore, please. That's ice. But this one to me, again, the everything from beginning, middle to end, it's a 92 proof. This is perfectly blended, perfectly mixed, perfectly created. This is as close as I can get to a perfect whiskey, so I don't add anything to it. There's nothing to gain for me, for my palate, to adding anything to it. So that's why. I was gonna say something else before Ryan rudely interrupted me. I don't remember what it was.
Sorry.
No, I really don't remember what it was. I get sidetracked very easily. Okay, well, any questions about the Glendronach or the distillery? I have one more story to tell about the distillery itself, and then we'll move on to round number 2, I guess 3 technically. So there's this really cool tradition in the Glendronach distillery. Every year, a flock of ravens come and they nest in the dunnage at Warehouse 13, specifically Warehouse 13. And it's so much so a part of the tradition and legacy of the distillery that if you notice your lapel pin that you received from the Glendronach, the raven is actually on the lapel pin. And they believe very superstitiously, as many Scotsmen are, that if should the ravens ever fail to come back, that the distillery itself would fail to operate and that the whiskey itself would never be capable of sustaining a quality product. So the ravens are a big part of the distillery in Scotland, and they are so cared for and they wait for them every spring to come back. So that it's so important that they actually put it on the lapel, and as part of the branding of the brand, they feel so strongly for the ravens that return every year to the Glendronach facility. So kind of a fun fact there. And one last founder story before we move on to Benirach. James Alvarez was an interesting character. He was the founder, and he wasn't the founder for very long, or he wasn't the owner for very long. In fact, he died in the late 1830s, and when he died, the family tried to run it for a little while, but ultimately it was sold off to several people who used the Glendronach as fillers for blended scotch. Blended scotch being anything that doesn't come from a single malt. Maybe they add extra grain to it. Maybe they use a lot of oat or a lot of malt, or they use a lot of wheat or something like that. But every blended malt scotch, think Johnny Walker or Monkey Shoulder, our current ones, have a portion of them being single malt, because all of the flavor that you get comes from single malt scotch in a blended scotch. So for many years, right in through the 1900s, the Glendronach was really just a part of a blend. But James Aldris, going back to him for just a second, he was a really unique and charismatic individual, and the way that he made his scotch known was somewhat unorthodox and bordering on unethical. But he would go into towns like Edinburgh or Elgin, and he would go bar to bar and try to sell his liquid, as we do today. And when he was rejected out of hand time and time again, he would then go around in the evening to the ladies of the night and offer them a free drink to get their night started, as long as when they went into the next bar, they asked for a glass of the Glendronach. So with that practice in mind, he ended up becoming the number 1 seller of scotch in Scotland and Elgin and Edinburgh and over the course of the early 1800s. So it's a fun, well-documented fact of how the Glendronach associated themselves with the neighborhoods and the alleys of Edinburgh and Elgin, if you will. So the Glendronach, sláinte. The next one we're going to taste is a wonderful bottle called the Benirach, the white label here. The Benirach is really a fantastic representation. So I talked much earlier about that association and that seeking of an identifier for the Speyside region. And if you were to pull out that identifier and read down the list of the ways that the Speyside thinks they're different from the Highlands and why they deserve their own indicator and why they were different from everybody else, what you would find was that they said things like finding of orchard fruits, the notes of citrus and lemons, limes, nuts, berries, things like that. And really it was true. In the perfect representation of a Speyside, you should find specifically in Keeley those orchard fruits. And again, I'm speaking specifically things like apples and pears and those fall harvest tree fruits. It's very unique to that specific region that the pollen and the pollen contributes to the harvest and to the yeast, and you end up with this incredible balance of different flavors that are all based in the orchard. So as we go through these, we can start with the Benirach 10-year-old, which should be the third bottle in your arsenal there tonight. Ooh, that one got a little heat in it. Oh, I know what I was going to talk about before Ryan so rudely interrupted me. And I'm actually going to go back to it because it's kind of an important little note here. So if you look in your bottle and you're seeing floaties, and it's especially going to be true of what you poured out of your 15. In fact, see if I can get a couple of them going in mine here. There we go. If you look in your 15, you might find some floaties. Looks like sediment or maybe little fat globules floating through your sample. What you're seeing there is something called flocculation. Flocculation is what happens when the whiskey chills down to a certain temperature and the fat and the acids and the lipids that are all in there from fermentation and distillation start coagulating and lumping themselves together. If you were to put one of these bottles, I'll take the 15-year-old as a for instance, and put it in the freezer for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, you will actually physically see it happening where these fats and acids start lumping together. It's not a bad thing. In fact, it's a good thing. It's what you want. And I'm not talking about just in Scotch whiskey. I'm talking about whiskey in general. If there's not a certain amount of flocculation, what that means is that product has been over filtered and the filtration of that product has taken away some of the essence or a majority even of the essence of it. So shorthand, it's flock. The full term is flocculation. There's such an negative association with flock in the US that we actually did not ship a product to the US this year because the flock was so heavy. We felt like the American consumers would not accept it. So I have decided that was stupid. And it is now part of my mission that I am going to educate everybody about flock and that it's a good thing and that you should look for bottles that have little floaties when the temperature in the room is below 70 degrees. If you don't see any floaties, it's not good whiskey. Put it back on the shelf and grab something else. There, I've done my bit. So now the Benirach. The Benirach, as I mentioned, is on a hill in the heart. Like if you threw a dart and tried to hit a bullseye in the middle of the Speyside, you'd hit the Benirach distillery. It has its own well. It has its own land. It's we source everything locally, and we have some pretty amazing product with us. The founder of the Benirach is a gentleman by the name of John Duff, and John Duff was an interesting character. He worked for the Glenmorangie for a time. He worked for the Freud for a time. He worked for the Talisker for a time. And right around the 1870s, 1880s, he decided he was going to start his own distillery, but he was going to do it in South America. So he went to South America, ultimately failed. Around 1890, he moved to Kentucky to open a distillery and ran into trouble there as well and was not able to ultimately be successful opening a distillery in Kentucky. But then he moved back to Scotland and opened the Benirach in 1898. The best thing that can be said about John Duff's timing is that it was god awful. The poor man was just a train wreck when it comes to timing. In the year 1900, something called the Pattison crash happened, and 1/3 of the distilleries in Scotland closed. If you remember, said that he opened his distillery in 1898. So 2 years of operation, not even a full time to get a bottle of scotch out of the barrel. And he had to shut down the Benirach distillery. It stayed shuttered for 65 years. And honestly, it would have been bulldozed if it wasn't for our malting. The Benirach has to this day one of the most unique malting floors in all of Scotland. We're one of only two that do traditional floor maltings the way that it was done from the beginning of time. We don't use machines. We use a gentleman who goes through after the barley has been steeped and soaked. It's spread out over the floor, and a gentleman walks through and turns the barley by hand every 2 hours, goes up and down the rows, turning the barley and making sure that it doesn't start growing, because what happens when you steep is you're watering that seed and it can actually start sprouting again. You have a sprouted barley in your fermentation tank, and you're going to destroy the entire fermentation vat. So you have to make sure that barley doesn't sprout and it stays dead and it doesn't begin to grow. Incidentally, I've already mentioned the name, but that gentleman who turns would often develop a huge left shoulder from the turning and the lifting and the bending of the shovel, and that the nickname for those guys is the monkey shoulder, and that's where the name for that blended scotch comes from. Is the monkey shoulder, is that huge overdevelopment of one shoulder of the body. Looks like there's a little monkey perched on your shoulder. Fun fact. Brian's full of fun facts. So what we do with our barley, though, is we separate half of it after it's been floor dried, and then we take half of that and we dry it the rest of the way with peat. Now, the peat from the Speyside is going to be different from the peat from the Highlands. As I mentioned, on the Islay, you don't have any trees or leaves or pines or anything like that. So what you're left with is that mossy growth in the ground. In the Highlands, or in the Speyside in this case, what you end up with is, think northern Michigan, go up to the Porcupine Mountains, and what would you get if you dug down 10,000 years worth of soil to find the moss and peat that's growing there? It's the same kind of lateral equator. You would find all that big dark wood and those flavors of oaks and trees and so on and so forth. So when you smell one of the peated whiskeys from the Benirach, you'll identify it almost immediately as Michigan campfire. That's what the smell is. I didn't give you guys any peateds tonight. I felt like too many people associate scotch only with peat, that I didn't want to leave that on your palate tonight. I wanted you to see and experience something new. But if you are interested in that, and if you're interested in peat, the Benirach peat is really a unique touch, and it's really something that's a little bit different and a little bit more out there. So there's that. So we're going to do the Benirach 10-year-old. And again, we can do some of the same things we did before, right? We're going to give it a little whirl, and let's see how long our legs last on this one. And again, lots of oils, lots of big mouth. The legs last for quite a good long time here. And then on the nose, this one is, I always use this analogy. I don't know how many people watched Pete's Dragon as a kid. I was mildly obsessed with that movie, apparently. I've been told. I may or may not have watched it on repeat and rewind and repeat. So I get it from my cousins every time I see them. And I'm 45 years old now. It's like, get it, guys. But there's a scene in the movie where the dragon is roasting apples and tossing them to the kid. And that's really one of the flavors that just comes so strongly through to me, is that kind of like baked apple, pear, apricot, nuts and caramels, and they're all kind of in there. So right on the nose, you're going to get all those kind of really great flavors and profiles, and keeping that glass just below the nose and letting it whip through. Those should be what you find. And then on the palate, it's just another example of that. What's on the nose is not different from the mouth. It activates all those sweet, fruity notes in that sweet range of your palate, right in the middle region, where you're going to find all of your sweet receptors in the middle and the back, and it's really going to just kind of pop and bring you an incredible flavor. I love this one. This is one of the ones that people who tell me I don't like scotch, I'm a bourbon guy, I will almost immediately pull out a bottle of the Benirach 10-year-old and say, all right, give this a try. Part of the reason for that is because of the casking. One of the things that Mr. Duff learned when he was out and about was that casks matter and the quality of wood matters. And we have a really fortunate situation, and none of this is going to matter today or tomorrow because we're still 10 years from when, or 8 years from when Brown-Forman bought it. But we had an association with Billy Walker, even going back into 2002. He would buy directly from Jack Daniels and Old Forester and Woodford Reserve and buy his bottles, buy his American casks directly from us. Rather than taking a chance at auction, he knew that we owned our own cooperages so that we could control the quality of our wood. And since we can only use our barrels one time, he knew he could buy them directly from us. So as long as we had a relationship, or he had a relationship with us, he would be able to buy that wood directly from Brown-Forman and maintain a consistency, at least in that, so that his base was very solid. Now, on top of that base, what do? You can you can put your whiskey in anything we mentioned, right? So you can put it in port cask. You can put it in Caribbean rum casks. You can put it in red wine muscatel casks. You can put it in Chardonnay casks. You can put your whiskey into anything that you want. It's just a matter of how does it play with the whiskey. And if you look at this Benriach 10-year-old, and you guys don't have the bottle, but if you did, you'd see that it has Jamaican cask, virgin cask, and bourbon oak. So it's playing with all three of the characteristics that you would expect, or two of the characteristics that you would expect, virgin oak and bourbon oak, but then it's putting in that fun little play of, what's little Jamaican rum got to do with our whiskey? It's fun, and it opens up the sweetness, and it creates a new palate sensation. So the Benriach 10 really plays in that space of, begins the exploration of wood and experimentation. Some of the best single casks of whiskey that I've ever had, regardless of point of origin, come from the Benriach because they're willing to experiment with casks. There will be a release coming out in one of the stores in Michigan in the next month or next couple of weeks, I hope, that is a red wine muscatel 14-year-old Scotch whiskey. It's a completely unique product. We couldn't really use it to do anything with, any of our other casks, but we can create a market for just those unique single barrels and those one-offs, those kind of cool expressions. And it makes it a lot of fun. It gives you a lot of creativity to explore the art of whiskey making. Any questions so far? I'm just sitting here talking to myself, I feel like. Not that I mind.
Last time I had a question, it was a whole situation. So
well, you did bail. No, I'm just kidding. I love questions. Questions are my favorite, especially when it comes to Scotch, because as you may have picked up on, I'm very passionate about Scotch. Scotch is, yes, sir. I see a question from the peanut gallery.
No, I was going to ask, with this one, do you recommend the droplets of water in this or no?
You can. It's a very light whiskey and a very young whiskey. So there's not a lot of play to be had in it. It's a very, the Benriach, because it sits as high as it sits, even its temperature variants are very mild to begin with. One of the things that I'll talk about here in a second is that the region of Scotland only has about a 40-degree temperature variation. Mm-hmm. From 40 to 80 degrees. That's about all the temperature variation you get. So you're not generally speaking, for crying out loud, for you're not generally speaking getting a huge influx of hot and cold into the whiskey. So what you end up with is just kind of a more balanced whiskey on a younger grain. So when you're talking about a 10-year-old, you have this 10-year-old whiskey, and the distillate is still very young. If you're thinking 10 years old, you think like 3.5 years old worth of American aging. Mm-hmm. So you're still dealing with a young distillate. Now you put a couple drops of water in there and you're going to open up some florals and some aromas. But again, this is because it's on white oak, because it's not being in and out of the wood very much. I just enjoy the distillate. But again, there is no filtration process. So yeah, when you add water to it, it's going to change the dynamics of it quite a bit. But I don't know that it's necessarily a good thing for this brand to add the water.
All right, thank you.
At least not at 10 years. Now, I snuck a drink of the 12-year-old. I'm sorry. The 12-year-old is where I think this brand really lives. I think it's the best representation of this particular brand. And I love the 12-year-old. That's going to be your last of your sample bottles, your fourth one, going from left to right. And the Benriach has this really, again, we mentioned it already, a really unique sense of casking. So the first one has the bourbon cask and the virgin cask, and it's got the Jamaican rum cask. And now we're going to add into that. We're going to change it up, and we're going to say, all right, we still want some bourbon cask. But what happens if we add some sherry cask and some port cask? Well, let's see. What it's going to really lend to a lot of sweetness. And this is where you asked about the water. This is the one where I think adding a little bit of water makes a huge difference, because it explodes the floral nature of those two darker wood casks. The port, the tawny port, and the sherry casking, the Olorosa casking. That little bit of water just explodes the floral notes on those particular casks and really changes the maturation a little bit. That a little bit of extra time on wood is going to change the dynamic of the whiskey pretty substantially, as you'll find in just a minute. So again, on the nose, you're going to get all the sweetness, and now you're almost dealing with like a carameled apple or a candied apple, candied cherries and cinnamon. It's all going to be right in the palate, right in the nose there, and nothing really changes on the palate. It is what it represents itself to be. Those kind of sweet candied fruits, those sweet, delicate orchard fruits, a little bit of floral in there, very limited spice, enough to make the front of your tip of your tongue tingle just a little bit, but not so much that you're blown away going, black pepper, black pepper. It's a lot of fun. It's a little bit of a different thing. So I'm going to take mine and I'm going to put a couple of drops of water, or just one drop of water in this one. And again, look right down. You're going to see that oil spill like thing happen. And then the nose on this one changes pretty dramatically right off the bat. It goes from kind of candied fruits to kind of orchard meadow. I was just in Texas, so the bluebonnets were blooming all over Texas while I was down there, and I mean, just the smell of the fields of bluebonnets just popping all over Texas is kind of what this reminds me of. A little bit more subtle, a little bit more floral, a lot less fruit, and a lot less orchardy. And then on the palate, it really mutes that even limited amount of spice that you had the first time, and really opens up the back end of the palate and really hits the throat and the back of the tongue, and really brings forward all of those kind of more tart, less spicy, more tart finishes that are really there and exist within the port cask and the sherry cask. So that's really where this one sits and lives and breathes, is with a little bit of water. Now, John Duff wasn't a lucky man in terms of his timing, but what he did do was leave us with a pretty awesome legacy. And as I mentioned, we do our floor maltings, and we're one of the last two distilleries to actually still do that and manage our floor maltings by hand. There's only one other distillery, but that is really the secret to our success. Without doing that, and without that traditional, almost artisan sense of self, the distillery would have been closed long before, because the reason we're still alive today as a distillery is because for 65 years, we floor malted the malts for 3 or 4 different distilleries through the Speyside of Scotland. And that's the reason that the Benirach distillery was never demolished, is because of our floor malting facility. So that artisan, that craft, that real care for the craftsmanship of the whiskey is still so important to Alan McConaughey, our master distiller, and Dr. Rachel Berry, our master blender today. It's just a wonderful attribute, a wonderful testament to the legacy of the Benirach distillery in the Speyside. I think that sort of wraps up the educational portion and tasting portion of the evening. Does anybody have any questions about Scotch in general, the Scotches you tasted? Anything else I can bore you to tears with when it comes to Scotch today?
About that one-off you spoke about.
I'm sorry?
Explain a little bit about that one-off you talked about.
So again, when they're putting things into casks, sometimes it's for exploration. Sometimes it's to say, hey, if we had 50 casks or 100 of this type of cask, what would it contribute to our overall whiskey? And oftentimes that's nothing. It means we're going to try it. We're going to do something different. If we think it can contribute to something later, great. If we don't think it can contribute to an age statement product like the Benirach 12-year-old or the 15-year-old or whatever, then it's a one-off. It's we're going to go ahead and sell this barrel when we think it's the right frame to sell it, but we're not going to run with that barrel and do 50 barrels of it to blend into something down the road. So it's going to be coming to Superfine in Canton. Leif and I picked it out among a bunch of different casks that we tried, and it's a wild, incredible, unique, dark, rich red wine muscatel cask, and it's all aged in muscatel. It'll be about 14 years old, and it'll come out at cask strength. And now cask strength is where you really get into playing with water, because cask strength is like 125, 126, 130, and I can drink whiskey at that proof, but it doesn't offer a lot to the palate. It really can cook the palate fast. So instead of just using a drop or two, maybe I'll use an entire dropper into my whiskey at that range and proof it down a little bit more and make it a little bit more fun and experience that whiskey in a different way. So, but that's the one-off that's coming out. It's a red wine muscatel. We are one of only 5 states that received a Benirach cask from last year. So kind of cool.
Cool.
And then too, I wanted you to mention, Bryan, about the coupon that was in the box for the engraving.
Absolutely. So we have an engraver by the name of David. You probably see his name there at the bottom of the email. But David just got his very own round bottle engraver. We're all very excited about that. So if you wanted to buy any of the brands from tonight or even the Old Forester, you can buy it and take that little tablet into a store, and we can engrave the side of the bottle right here. We can do about 2 to 3 lines of text here. Same thing with the Glendronach. I got one for my dad, as I got him a bottle of the 15-year-old. It just says, "Happy Father's Day. Thanks for being there. Love, Bryan." It's something cool, something simple you can do for the dad in your life, or just the man in your life, whether he's a dad or not. But you can that coupon is in there for you. It is complimentary. All you got to do is buy the booze, and we'll provide the engraving. Right now, we're doing pickups and drop-offs. We're still kind of not able to go into stores and set up. So pick the store you want, go in, buy the product, give them that coupon and their bottle, and they'll get it. Dave will schedule a time to pick it up and engrave it and get it back to you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
No problem. Oh, and usually ML has most of our stuff close by. I don't know where everybody's proximity is, but ML, Keiko's, Superfine. If you're in the Rochester area, you've got Zatuna's. So Jack carries just about everything we've got. Canton, Superfine, I'd recommend. Novi Party Store. Cal carries just about everything. So you can, if you're having a hard time finding it, you can reach out to me through Ryan, and I'll be happy to see if I can locate a bottle for you if there was one that you really like that you'd like to get and have engraved.
And then just one final question. I know you said that Scotch is your absolute favorite, and I know we did the bourbon tasting with you about a month ago. So if you could just maybe share why Scotch is your absolute favorite.
I like the roundness of the mouth. I kind of half made the joke during our bourbon tasting that if you want to be super impressive at your next bourbon tasting, you can say the following: "Oh, I'm getting hints of caramel," and "Oh, vanilla," and "Oh, that's very oaky." You can say those things, and you're right 100% of the time, because that's what bourbon is. That's at its very core, it is whiskey that is double distilled, barreled at 125 on white American virgin oak, and that's it. No matter what else your mash bill is, after the distillate is created at 125 proof, you're putting white liquid onto white American oak, and that's it. There's no complication above and beyond that. Now you can get subtleties, you can get time, you can play with different aspects of it, and there are subtleties to bourbon, but the palate range is here. This is the palate range for bourbon, and that's not a slam at bourbon. That's just what it is. Now, if you take it to Scotland, and even though there are 3 ingredients, barley, yeast, and wood, 2 of those ingredients can change the dynamic of a whiskey as made sitting next to each other at any given time. I could change my yeast strain in this barrel, and it's going to completely and dynamically change my distillate and my whiskey. I can change my wood in this barrel, and it's going to completely and totally change my maturation in my whiskey. So those two little ingredients, or those two little factors, can change wildly and dynamically the entirety of the whiskey and how it's presented and how it's processed. So there's so much range. And I always say this, and I would have closed with this eventually, which got me there ahead of time, is that there's a scotch for everybody. I don't care if you like whiskey, there's a scotch for you. It may not be one of these four that we tried tonight. It may be something from a small island in the middle, the southern tip called Arran. It may be something in a Western Isle called Jura. It might be something from a lowland distillery called Oban. I mean, there are so many different regions and parts of Scotland and so much different whiskey to choose from and so much different maturation that I can go through 130 distilleries and call it 10 different offerings from every single distillery, and every single one of those 1,300 different whiskeys is going to taste dramatically different from the last. There will be notes of similarity, but the overall structure of each one will be dramatically different, as opposed to them being fundamentally the same with minor variations on the theme. So if this is the bourbon whiskey palette, this is the Scotch whiskey palette. And that's why, for me, Scotch is so much fun. Some of it's the exploration of whiskey itself, and I just enjoy that. I mean, I'm not going to try to tell you I don't. I enjoy trying new things and different things. Some of it is finding that one thing that I love, like the Glendronach 15, and that's just always in my arsenal. But more than any of those things, it's that you can find different things all the way through wherever you go. And even within a distillery that only does two different types of maturation, like the Glendronach, you get 5 different marks: Portwood, 12, 15, 18, 21. And none of the 3 of those are the same, even though it's only using 2 different maturation processes in the same yeast strain. That's what's fun to me about Scotch. And that's why, to me, Scotch is so much more fun and interesting. And yes, significantly more expensive. There's no getting around that. It's a significantly more expensive hobby than bourbon. I can get 3 different bottles of Old Forester for what it would cost me to buy one of these. But if you have the time and if you find it and you get 1 bottle instead of 4, it's fun. That's why it's more different and unique to me.
Thank you.
One question I had, you mentioned there's 3 ingredients in Scotch. What is there in bourbon? Is it different, same amount, or just different ingredients?
So bourbon is going to rely on a mash bill. And the only requirement for bourbon is that it be 51% corn. After that, you can really put whatever you want into your bourbon, as long as it's 51% corn. Now, generally speaking, a mash bill for bourbon is going to be 51% corn, or is going to be corn, malted barley, and rye in some measure. The Old Forester we tasted last month was a 72-18-10 mash bill, 72% corn, 18% rye, 10% barley. So they're playing with a little bit of pepper from the rye, a little bit of rounding from the barley, a lot of sweetness from the corn, and that's where they're making their profile. Whiskeys that have a much higher corn count are going to be sweeter. Mash bills that are significantly lower are going to generally be more spicy or hot or red, just kind of poppy. Amanda's back. Yay. All right. Well, if anybody has any other questions, otherwise I'll throw it back to Amanda and Ryan and put myself on mute.
Thank you so much, Bryan. We always appreciate our collaborations with you. Thank you, everyone, for participating tonight. And we hope that you really, really liked the Scotch education. And then I don't know if you had anything you wanted to say, Amanda.
No, just thank you, everybody. Thank you, Bryan. As always, it's always really fun to explore the different options and to get the history on it. So again, yeah, thank you so much. And Jesus wants to know when's the next one. So
I know, in TBD, right?
we gotta find about that. But he's like,
Yeah.
when's the next one?
That's
It's my
gonna
first
be
one.
Ryan
It's
and
my
Amanda now. I'm just a guy here ready to do what you need for me. So
It's my first one, and I had a good time.
awesome.
Thanks,
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Perfect. So thank you, everyone. And literally stay tuned. I'm sure we'll be doing one in the next couple months. Everyone seems to really enjoy it. So keep an eye out for the next box.